The sinkhole had been there longer than the town. That was the first thing everyone said about it, as if the age of the problem made it more legitimate. As if a hole in the ground that had been swallowing snowmelt for 10,000 years had earned the right to keep doing it. It sat on the limestone ridge above Kittleson, Wisconsin, 100 yards from the house, a rough circle of collapsed rock about 40 feet across and 20 feet deep, surrounded by a ring of bur oaks, whose roots had spent centuries gripping the crumbling edge and refusing to let go. Every spring, when the snow on the ridge melted, the water ran downhill and poured into the sinkhole like a bathtub drain running in reverse, filling it to the brim in a matter of days. And then slowly, over 2 or 3 weeks, the water vanished. It seeped through the cracks in the limestone floor and drained into whatever was below. And by June, the sinkhole was dry again. Just a rocky depression full of wet silt and mosquitoes and the faint smell of mud that has been somewhere dark and come back changed. The lawyer's name was Engstrom. He had an office above the hardware store in Viroqua, and on the morning of April 8, 1937, he read the will of Einar Voss to a room that contained 3 people: the county tax assessor, a neighbor named Delbert Koss, who had come because he thought there might be an unpaid fence dispute to settle, and Einar's granddaughter, Margit Voss, age 15, who had taken the bus from the Crawford County Home for Children in Prairie du Chien and arrived with mud on her shoes and a paper sack containing everything she owned. Then Engstrom read that Einar had left Margit the house, the outbuildings, 80 acres of ridgeland, and, he cleared his throat, the sinkhole and all improvements made therein and thereto. Delbert Koss shifted in his chair and said, "He left her the hole. Lord have mercy, he left that girl the hole." The tax assessor, who had been trying to value the property and had written negligible in the assessment field, said nothing. Margit looked at Engstrom and said, "What improvements?" Einar Voss had come to Crawford County from Bergen, Norway, in 1896, at the age of 23, because someone in a church in Bergen had told him that the coulee country of Wisconsin looked like Norway, and the land was cheap. The first part was true. The second part was true because the land that was cheap for a reason. The ridgetops were limestone karst, which meant sinkholes, which meant your field could swallow a plow horse without warning, and your well could go dry overnight, because the water table sat inside a maze of underground channels that went where they wanted and didn't consult the farmer above. Einar bought 80 acres on the ridge because it was $2 an acre, and he had $160 and an unwillingness to negotiate that the Norwegians in the valley attributed to stubbornness and Einar attributed to knowing what he wanted. What he wanted was the sinkhole. Margit's mother, Anna, had died of scarlet fever in 1928. Her father, Einar's son, Karl, had died in 1930, struck by a car on the highway outside Viroqua while walking home from a job that paid 50 cents a day. Einar tried to keep Margit. The county said no. A 70-year-old man living alone on a ridge with a sinkhole and no indoor plumbing was not, in the opinion of the county welfare office, an appropriate guardian for a child. Einar argued. He brought a jar of pickled beets and a hand-drawn diagram of the sinkhole's drainage system to the hearing, as if preserved vegetables and hydrology were evidence of parenting capacity. They weren't, according to the judge. Margit went to the county home. Einar went back to the ridge. He visited every month until 1935, when his hip gave out and the bus ride became impossible. He wrote letters instead. The letters always ended the same way. "The hole is ready. You'll understand when you see it. Stay with me, because what Einar built inside that sinkhole over 18 years and what his granddaughter found when she finally climbed down into it is the reason this story is still told in Crawford County today. The Crawford County Home for Children was a limestone building on the bluff above the Mississippi River that smelled like lye soap and boiled cabbage, and housed 32 children who had been placed there by a county that believed in shelter and supervision and not much else. The building had been a poorhouse before it was a children's home, and it carried that history in its walls. The hallways were wide enough for cots, the windows were high enough to discourage climbing, and the rooms had the institutional blankness of spaces designed to contain people rather than house them. The matron was a woman named Mrs. Dahl, who ran the home the way a factory foreman runs a floor. Schedules, quotas, silence. Children woke at 6, ate at 6:30, cleaned until 8, attended the schoolroom until 3, cleaned again until 5, ate at 5:30, and were in bed by 7:30. The schedule did not vary. The food did not vary. The expectations did not vary. What varied was the children, and Mrs. Dahl considered this a problem to be managed rather than a condition to be respected. Margaret was not built for silence. She asked why the limestone walls sweated in summer. Was it condensation from temperature differential, or was the water coming through the rock itself? She asked why the well behind the home went dry every August. Was the water table seasonal, or was the well in the wrong place? Or she asked where the water went and where it came back from, and whether the rock underneath the building was the same rock that made the sinkholes on the ridge tops. Which it was, because the entire driftless region sat on soluble dolomite and limestone that had been dissolving since the last ice age, missed this corner of Wisconsin, and left the rock exposed to 10,000 years of rain. Mrs. Dahl said she asked too many questions for a girl in her position. Margaret said, "My grandfather says questions are how you find water." Mrs. Dahl said, "Your grandfather lives in a hole," which was not entirely inaccurate, but missed the point in the way that people who don't understand holes tend to miss the point about people who do. The ride from Viroqua took 40 minutes on a road that wound up out of the coulee, along the ridgetop, and past farms that got smaller and poorer the further from the valley you went. The mail carrier dropped her at a wooden gate with Voss carved into the post, and she walked the last quarter-mile to the house, a small frame building with a porch that faced south toward the sinkhole. She could see it from the porch. It looked exactly like what Delbert Koss had said it was, a hole. A big, rocky, empty hole with oak trees clinging to the edges and a puddle of dirty snowmelt at the bottom that was already beginning to seep through the cracks. She went inside. The house was small, clean, and organized with the precision of a man who had lived alone for a long time and had settled every argument about where things belonged. A wood stove, a rope frame bed, a plank table, a shelf of canning jars, your end, covering the entire south wall of the main room, a drawing. Not a map, a cross-section. Einar had drawn in pencil on a 6-foot sheet of butcher paper tacked to the wall, a complete cross-section of the sinkhole and everything beneath it. The surface layer, the limestone bedrock, fractured and porous. The drainage channels where the spring meltwater flowed downward. And at the bottom, 30 feet below the surface, a chamber. A limestone cavern, roughly 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a domed ceiling and a floor that was covered in a thick layer of alluvial silt deposited by 18 years of spring floods, draining through the rock above. The drawing showed the silt beds in detail, terraced, leveled, built up with stone retaining walls. It showed drainage channels carved into the chamber floor to control where the water went when it arrived and how fast it left. It showed a reflected light system, tin panels positioned near the natural entrance shaft to bounce daylight into the chamber. And in the corner of the drawing, in Einar's careful hand, 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Humidity 80%. The flood brings the soil. The limestone holds the temperature. The chamber does the rest. Einar's journals filled a wooden crate beside the stove. 18 years of entries, from 1919 to 1937, documenting the sinkhole's cycle with the precision of a man who understood that water is a clock and limestone is a calendar, and if you pay attention long enough, the pattern becomes a plan. The spring flood arrived in late March or early April, depending on the snowpack and the temperature, and the timing varied by as much as 2 weeks from year to year. Einar had recorded the date of first inflow and last outflow for every spring since 1919. A dataset so complete that he could predict the flood's arrival within 3 days based on the snowpack depth he measured at the ridgetop on March 1st. The water filled the sinkhole to a depth of 12 to 15 feet, brown and heavy with sediment, and drained over 3 weeks through fractures in the limestone floor. The drainage was not random. The fractures had specific capacities, and Einar had mapped them all, numbering each fracture and recording its flow rate in gallons per hour at different fill levels. Fracture A drained the fastest. Fracture D drained the slowest and was closest to the growing beds. He'd positioned the beds near fracture D because slower drainage meant more silt deposition. The water carried with it a slurry of topsoil, leaf litter, and decomposed organic matter from the ridge above, rich, dark, fertile silt that settled on the chamber floor as the water receded. Each spring's flood deposited 2 to 3 inches of new silt. Over 18 years, Einar had accumulated nearly 4 feet of the richest growing medium in Crawford County. Soil that had been filtered through limestone, enriched with organic matter, and delivered by gravity to an underground room where the temperature never dropped below 52 degrees and the humidity never fell below 80%. He had tested the silt's composition annually, mixing samples with vinegar and baking soda the way old farmers tested soil, and noting the results in a table at the back of each year's journal. The silt was slightly alkaline, high in calcium from the limestone, rich in nitrogen from the decomposed leaf litter, and held moisture better than any surface soil on the ridge because the limestone walls of the chamber prevented evaporation. It was, by any measure, perfect growing medium. And the flood delivered it for free, every spring, without fail, the way a river delivers soil to a floodplain. Except this river went underground, and this floodplain was inside a mountain. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing. We share stories like this every week. Ordinary people who found extraordinary things in the places the world gave up on. The first winter tested her the way all first winters test the people in these stories. Not with a single catastrophe, but with a grinding accumulation of small failures. The stove ate firewood faster than she could split it. The roof leaked in 2 places. The canning jars on the shelf were Einar's last harvest, pickled beets, sauerkraut, dried beans. And they ran out by February. She ate oatmeal and potatoes from the root cellar and lost weight she didn't have to spare. The sinkhole sat outside the window, frozen and useless looking, a white depression in the white landscape. On a night in January, when the temperature dropped to 22 below and the wind came through the walls like it owned the house, Margaret lay in the rope bed under Einar's quilt and read journal number 6 by the light of a candle stub. And the entry was dated February 12th, 1926. The chamber is 52 degrees. Outside it is 18 below. I planted kale starts in the east bed 3 weeks ago. They are 9 inches tall. The cold cannot reach them. The flood brings the soil, and the limestone holds the warmth, and the chamber grows what the surface cannot. I am not farming the land. I am farming the whole. Margaret closed the journal and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she put on Einar's boots, lit a lantern, and climbed down into the sinkhole for the first time. The entrance shaft was on the north side. A natural crack in the limestone wall of the sinkhole that Einar had widened with a chisel over several years into a passage large enough to walk through, stooped for about 20 feet before it opened into the chamber below. And the passage was cool and damp and smelled like wet stone and earth. The chamber was exactly what the drawing showed. 60 feet long, 30 wide, domed ceiling at about 12 feet. The floor was silt, dark, rich, moist, layered. Einar's stone retaining walls divided it into terraced beds, 6 inches to a foot deep, each level slightly lower than the last, so water drained from the highest to the lowest by gravity. The drainage channel along the east wall carried excess water to a natural crack in the floor, where it disappeared back into the Karst system. The tin reflectors near the entrance shaft caught the gray winter daylight and threw it deeper into the chamber, not bright, but enough to see by, enough to grow certain things. And things were growing. Einar's last planting, done in September, 2 months before he died, was still alive. Kale in the near beds, pale but standing. Turnips in the middle beds, the greens wilted but the roots firm in the silt. Mushrooms on logs stacked against the far wall, oyster mushrooms in gray clusters, growing in the constant humidity without any tending at all. The chamber had been feeding itself since Einar died. The crops didn't know he was gone. They just kept growing in the dark, in the silt, in the 52-degree air that the limestone held like a promise. Margaret sat on a retaining wall and put her face in her hands and breathed. Not crying, breathing. The way you breathe when you realize the person who loved you most left you something you can live on. And the something is 30 feet underground in a hole that everyone in the county calls worthless. Arvid Lund showed up in March. The way people in these stories always show up. Not when you expect them, and not when you ask. He was 74 years old, Swedish, with white side whiskers that looked like they'd been trimmed with a pocket knife, and hands so calloused they were nearly the same color as the limestone he'd spent his life cutting into. He was deaf in his left ear from a blasting accident in 1908 and compensated by turning his right ear toward whoever was talking with the intensity of a man who had decided that half the sound in the world was enough if he paid attention to the right half. He'd been a well digger in the driftless region for 40 years. He knew the karst, the sinkholes, the caves, the underground streams, the fracture patterns, the way a doctor knows a body. He'd helped Einar widen the entrance shaft in 1922. He was the only person in Crawford County who had been inside the chamber and not laughed. His first words to Margaret, shouted because he couldn't gauge his own volume. "Your grandfather said if he died to give you one spring and then come see if the beds survived. The beds survived. Let's get to work." Together, they prepared for the spring flood. This was the critical part, the part Einar's journals described in the most detail, because the flood was both the system's fuel and its greatest threat. The melt water that poured into the sinkhole every spring brought the silt that renewed the growing beds, but it also brought force. Thousands of gallons of water moving fast through limestone fractures, capable of washing away everything Einar had built if the drainage channels weren't maintained and the retaining walls weren't sound. As Arvid showed Margaret how to read the sinkhole's water level. Notches Einar had carved in the rock wall at 6-inch intervals, each one dated, creating a flood gauge that went back to 1919. He showed her how to clear the drainage channels of debris before the melt started, so the water moved through the chamber instead of pooling in it. He showed her how to protect the growing beds during the flood by laying flat limestone slabs over the most vulnerable sections, creating armored caps that the water flowed over without disturbing the silt below. The flood came on March 29th. The snowmelt poured into the sinkhole from 3 directions, brown and thick with topsoil, and for 4 days, the hole was a lake. Then the water began to drain, slowly, steadily, and the way it had drained every spring for 10,000 years. And as it receded through the limestone floor, it deposited its cargo. 2.5 inches of fresh silt, dark and rich, spread evenly across the terraced beds. By the 3rd week of April, the chamber was damp, fertile, and ready. Margaret planted on April 22nd. Potatoes in the deep beds, turnips and carrots in the middle beds, kale and lettuce in the near beds under the reflectors. Mushroom logs restacked against the far wall. Einar's system worked exactly as the journals described. The silt was the soil, the limestone was the thermostat, the humidity was the irrigation, and the reflected daylight was enough for greens that didn't need full sun. By June, the first harvest. 12 pounds of kale, 8 pounds of turnips, and enough new potatoes to fill a bushel basket. She carried them up the shaft and set them on the kitchen table and looked at them the way you look at a letter that arrived years late, but said exactly what you needed to hear. Everything was about to change. Because while Margaret was harvesting underground, something was moving across the prairie from the west, a living cloud that would strip every surface crop in Crawford County down to bare dirt and leave 3,000 people with nothing to eat except what they'd stored. And Margaret had the only food source in the county that the cloud couldn't reach. By late summer of 1937, the system was producing steadily. Margaret expanded the beds using silt she redistributed from the flood deposits in the lower chamber where it accumulated thickest. She doubled the mushroom logs. Arvid brought her oak from a windfall on his property. Luck already inoculated with shiitake spawn he'd ordered from a catalog. She built new reflectors from tin she salvaged from an abandoned chicken coop down the road, and repositioned the panels based on light angle calculations she found in journal number 14, where Einar had drawn a diagram showing how the angle of the entrance shaft changed the direction of reflected light by season. Spring light came in steep and reached the far beds. Summer light came in shallow and lit the near beds. She adjusted the panels every 6 weeks. The chamber produced 12 months a year. The town noticed. Margit Voss wasn't at the county food pantry. Margit Voss was carrying baskets of vegetables to the general store in Kittelsen in July. And the storekeeper, a woman named Olive Stenberg, looked at the kale and said, "This is fresh. Where are you growing kale in July that looks like this?" Margit said, "In the ground." Olive said, "Everybody grows in the ground." Margit said, "Not everybody grows 30 feet down." Olive didn't understand. She would, eventually. The grasshoppers arrived on August 4th, 1937. They came from the west, from the dried-out rangeland of the Dakotas, where 3 years of drought had killed the grass and left nothing but bare soil and heat and the eggs of 10 billion Rocky Mountain locusts that hatched in June and rose in a cloud that darkened the sky from Bismarck to the Mississippi. They hit Crawford County at midday. People heard them before they saw them. A sound like static on a radio turned to maximum volume, a hissing rattle that vibrated in the bones. They landed on everything. They ate everything: corn, wheat, oats, hay, garden vegetables, the leaves off the fruit trees, the bark off the fence posts, the paint off the houses. They ate the laundry off the clotheslines. They ate the wooden handles off the tools left in the fields. A farmer named Suttles, who had 200 acres of oats ready for harvest, watched them take it in 4 hours. 4 hours, 200 acres. He sat on his porch and watched and didn't move, because there was nothing to do except watch and nothing to feel except the kind of emptiness that comes when the math stops working and you realize that everything you planted and tended and prayed over is being converted into insect protein in front of your eyes. But 30 feet below the surface of the ridge, in a limestone chamber with a constant temperature of 52 degrees and a humidity of 80%. The kale was growing. The turnips were growing. The potatoes were growing. The mushrooms were fruiting. The grasshoppers landed on the sinkhole rim and crawled to the edge and stopped because there was nothing for them there. Just rock and shadow and a draft of cool air rising from the entrance shaft that held no scent of leaves or stems or anything they wanted. They moved on. The chamber was untouchable. The underground beds were invisible. Einar had built a farm that existed below the reach of every surface catastrophe. Flood, frost, drought, wind, and now locusts. Because the earth itself was the wall, and the ceiling, and the insurance policy. And the earth doesn't care about grasshoppers. They came the following week. Not a crowd. Wisconsin coolie people come in pairs, in trucks, now with their hats in their hands, and their pride somewhere behind them on the road. Delbert Koss came first. The same Delbert who had said he left that girl the hole in the lawyer's office 5 months earlier. His garden was gone. His corn was gone. His wife's canning tomatoes, which she'd spent all summer tending, were eaten to the stem. He stood at Margit's porch and said, "I need food." He didn't say please. Margit said, "Come with me." She led him to the sinkhole, down the entrance shaft, and into the chamber. Delbert stood on the silt floor and looked at the growing beds and the mushroom logs and the kale standing green and untouched under reflected light, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather wasn't crazy." Margit said, "No, he wasn't." That moment changed everything, and the people who had laughed at the whole man's granddaughter would never look at that sinkhole the same way again. She fed the county. Not all of it. Crawford County had 16,000 people, and a sinkhole farm couldn't feed 16,000. But she fed Kittleson. She fed the families on the ridge. She fed the Koss family and the Stenberg family and the Suttles family who had lost 200 acres of oats in 4 hours. She organized harvests. 6 families rotating through the chamber on a schedule Arvid helped her design. So the beds were never stripped, and the recovery time between harvests was respected. She taught them Einar's system: which beds to plant, when to plant, how deep to plant in silt versus surface soil, and how to maintain the drainage channels so the next spring's flood would renew the beds instead of destroying them. Arvid managed the structural work, reinforcing the retaining walls, clearing the fractures, making sure the entrance shaft was stable. Margit managed the growing. Between them, the chamber produced 400 pounds of food per month through the fall and winter of 1937, enough to keep 40 families from going hungry while the surface world recovered from a plague that had stripped it bare. Delbert came back alone in October. He walked to the sinkhole edge and stood there looking down. Then he said, "I told my wife your grandfather was crazy. I told her the hole was worthless. I told her you'd sell the land and leave." Margit was carrying a bucket of silt from the lower chamber to the upper beds. She set the bucket down. "I know," she said. Delbert said, "He was the smartest man on this ridge, and I couldn't see it because I was standing on top of the ground, and he was standing inside it." Margit picked up the bucket. "The hole doesn't hold grudges," she said. "It just floods and drains and grows. That's what my grandfather loved about it. It has a cycle, and it follows the cycle, and it doesn't care who believes in it." Delbert helped her carry the silt without being asked, which in Crawford County in 1937 was as close to a formal apology as a man like Delbert Koss could physically produce. A man came in the spring of 1938. Tobias Fenn, a soil scientist from Madison, who had read a county extension report about underground cultivation in Karst sinkholes and driven 4 hours to see it because he assumed the report was exaggerated. He descended the entrance shaft, stood in the chamber, measured the silt depth, the temperature, the humidity, and the light levels, and said, "This is not exaggerated. This is underreported." He spent a week in the chamber, sampling soil from each terrace, testing the alluvial silt for nutrient content, and measuring the spring flood's deposit rate. He said Einar's system was an accidental masterpiece of subsurface agriculture exploiting the natural fertility delivery mechanism of karst hydrology. Margit showed him the journals. He read them sitting on a retaining wall with his feet in silt and his mouth slightly open. He said, "Your grandfather documented a natural process that the agricultural science community hasn't formally described yet." Margit said, "He didn't describe it. He used it. That's different." Tobias looked at her. "It's better," he said. He published a paper. He credited Einar Voss on the first page. Margit checked the spelling. He also stayed. Not for the science, for the way Margit talked about the silt, the water, the cycle. She talked about it the way Einar wrote about it, with specificity and affection, as if the whole were alive, and the flood were a gift, and the chamber were a room in a house she'd always lived in, even when she'd been 30 miles away, in a county home. Tobias had a careful mind and a quiet voice, and he built soil maps the way Einar built retaining walls. Precisely, patiently, with attention to what the ground wanted to be. They married in the fall of 1938 in the chamber, with Arvid as witness and the drip of limestone water as the only music. Arvid died in the winter of 1941, 78 years old, his good ear still sharp enough to hear water moving through limestone 40 feet down. He'd told Margit a week before, "When I go, bury me by the sinkhole. I want to hear the spring flood come in one more time." They buried him on the east rim, where the bur oaks grew thickest, in soil that was thin over limestone and full of roots that had been holding the edge together for 200 years. Margit put his chisel on the headstone. It's still there, the edge worn bright from 40 years of cutting rock. The university came in 1949. A team from the University of Wisconsin who mapped the entire karst system beneath the ridge using Einar's journals as a starting guide. They confirmed 6 additional sinkhole chambers within 2 miles, 3 of them with flood deposit silt beds suitable for cultivation. The lead hydrologist called the system the most complete private documentation of karst hydrology in the upper Midwest. Margit received a letter from the governor. She put it in journal number 18, between Einar's flood gauge readings for March 1936 and his planting notes for April. Tobias mapped soils across the driftless region until his back gave out. Then he taught. He died in 1974, in the house, in the rope frame bed Einar had built. Margit buried him beside Arvid. Their daughter took over the chamber. Their granddaughter learned to read the journals. The sinkhole still floods every spring. The silt still settles on the beds. The temperature is still 52 degrees. The cycle hasn't changed in 10,000 years, and it won't change in the next 10,000. Because limestone doesn't forget how to hold water, and water doesn't forget how to carry soil, and the hole in the ground that everyone in Crawford County called worthless is still growing food in the dark the way it was growing food when Einar Voss first climbed down into it in 1919 with a lantern and a notebook and a Norwegian's conviction that the world's best secrets are the ones buried underground. If this story stayed with you, if the idea that a hole in the ground could feed a county when the sky itself turned hostile means something to you, subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.